let's talk about the Super Bowl again for a bit, specifically Kendrick's halftime show. For those who aren't North American, last Sunday was the NFL Super Bowl, an annual championship football game that takes place in February, and this year, the Philadelphia Eagles won. As did the culture. Kendrick Lamar played at the halftime show, and wowweee, was it something. Now, a multitude of videos, articles, and think pieces have already been put out about it over the past week, so I'm not trying to rehash what's already been said. I just want to focus on a small detail that really caught my attention. Why that long pause?
It's your Uncle Sam.
Now, I don't know about you, but I think it was purposeful. It could be a play on words with Samuel L. Jackson's own name or a sign of something more. I mean, a black Uncle Sam going off on another black man for being too loud, too reckless, too ghetto? Yeah, I know what you are. Throughout the performance, Uncle Sam seemed, to me at least, to take on the role of yet another uncle. An uncle named Tom. Let's talk about it. Having a historically white symbol of America be represented by a black man sure was an intentional choice. See, Uncle Sam is the personification of the US government, of American patriotism, and more importantly, of American propaganda. So having Samuel L. Jackson play this fictional figure as an antagonist that keeps telling Kendrick how to act is no coincidence. If you haven't seen it yet, throughout the performance, Uncle Sam tells Kendrick to be more demure and stick to the rules so as not to displease the overseers of the great American game. He's effectively telling Kendrick to submit to the machine just like he has, just like the many Toms before him have. See, the Tom caricature was born to essentially defend slavery. Just like the mammy, the Tom was portrayed as an old and faithful, smiling servant, content with his enslavement and eager to serve his enslavers. As Donald Bogle wrote in his book, Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, always as Toms are chased, harassed, enslaved, and insulted, they keep the faith, never turn against their white masses, and remain hearty, submissive, selfless, and oh so very kind. This partially explains why the term Uncle Tom has become an in-group insult to criticize those who consistently and humiliatingly do everything in their power to curry favor with white people. Many have been called out for being Uncle Toms. For example, civil rights leaders of the 60s were called Uncle Toms by more militant black people, and in a more concrete example, Justice Thomas was criticized in a 1996 issue of Emerge magazine as being Uncle Thomas lawn jockey for the far right. Essentially, Uncle Tom, or Tom, calls out black folks who only appear interested in serving white people or upholding white supremacist structures because they somehow think they're exempt or that they'll be saved. Really, it's about those who put the needs of the system, the white system, before the needs of the black community. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, the modern use of Uncle Tom is a far cry from the original portrayal. I mean, most of us have heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but have you really read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Written by Harriet Beecher Stowe and published in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is what we can refer to today as the first bestseller, and that is in no way an exaggeration because when it was published, it outsold the Bible. Yeah, they had to keep 17 printing presses open 24 hours a day to keep up with all the demand. As the Boston Morning Post declared on May 3rd, 1852, everyone has read it, is reading, or is about to read it. It became such a worldwide sensation that it spawned all kinds of products and can be pointed to as one of the first examples of mass merchandising. But more than that, it presented the evils of slavery in a way that humanized the enslaved and caused such a stir that many believe it was actually one of the catalysts for the Civil War. See, the story involves the trajectory of enslaved peoples Uncle Tom, Eliza, and George as they navigate slave owners, escapes, and general anguish. What's important to note here, however, is that the Tom in this novel is a man of principle, a hardworking and gentle Christian man who's ultimately beaten to death for refusing to reveal where two enslaved women, victims of sexual assault, are hidden. So the original Uncle Tom, although very forgiving to his white enslavers and some could argue too loyal and too obedient, was not weak or docile. Of course, certain reviews called out a double standard in that where white violence was completely acceptable, black folks had to turn the other cheek. But Uncle Tom still had depth and was painted with dignity. Harriet Beecher Stowe, daughter of a preacher and herself an abolitionist, wanted to show that slavery just simply wasn't in line with Christianity. slavery. Her objective, as stated in the first edition preface, was to, quote, awaken sympathy and feeling for the African race. So for her book, she looked into various accounts of real slaves who had escaped along the Underground Railroad and actually based Uncle Tom on the memoirs of Josiah Henson, a formerly enslaved laborer and Methodist minister. We'll get back to him in a bit. Uncle Tom's Cabin caused such an uproar that over 14 pro-slavery novels were written in response. In fact, The Klansman, which is what the racist fear-mongering movie Birth of a Nation is based on, was specifically written to counter the influence of the book. The author, a preacher named Thomas Dixon Jr., publicly said that it wasn't right how slave owners were portrayed as horrible individuals and slavery as a horrible institution. A preacher. Not to mention that pro-slavery newspapers popped up with titles like more anti-slavery fiction that mocked the book and scoffed at the very idea of Black liberation. The book had effectively shifted the Overton window, which refers to the range or window of ideas/policies a public is willing to accept at a certain given time. So where for a time abolitionists were dismissed as eccentric radicals, after the book came out, it became quite normal to talk about the evils of slavery, and Southerners didn't like that. Efforts were made to discredit the book, and Stowe actually had to publish another book in 1853 called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to all the backlash. In it, she laid out her very real inspiration and gave credit to the people she based it on, like Josiah Henson, who, it should be mentioned, never received a dime from Stowe's publishers. In fact, history itself doesn't remember the real-life Uncle Tom because of his connection to the fictional hero, and most importantly, what came next. The popularity of the book meant that a bunch of plays were adapted from it, but with those plays also came depictions that were never part of the original story. The stage versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, often called Tom shows, were steeped in blackface minstrelsy that depicted the enslaved as happy blacks living under a generous and valuable system. Not only was the violence of slavery grossly understated, but the stage depictions of Uncle Tom were completely devoid of Tom's original noble traits, notably that of his allegiance to the enslaved. As Patricia Turner wrote in Ceramic Uncles and Celluloid Mammies, quote, the reconstructed Uncle Toms are passive, docile, unthinking Christians. Loyal and faithful to white employers, they are duplicitous in their dealings with fellow black people. And where the original Uncle Tom was a broad-chested, strong-armed fellow, the Toms that followed him were elderly, weak, hunched over, and completely deceased. They were portrayed as docile, dark-skinned butlers, cooks, field workers, or waiters, and presented as non-threatening and completely dependent on white people for approval. And as black folks gained more and more freedoms, the perversion of Uncle Tom took deeper root. In fact, the 1930s and 40s were the peak of Tom depictions. The system really demanded that black people know their place. Black codes and Jim Crow laws weren't enough, so too did popular culture have to become a vehicle of anti-blackness. Thus, black male actors were limited to two stereotypical roles: the coons, such as Stepin Fetchit, which I've already talked about, and the Toms, like Bill Bojangles Robinson. Where the coon played the role of comic relief, the Tom suggested a nostalgic social order. For example, if a family had to be portrayed as having old money, well, that money came with a side of black servitude. The Tom kept on being portrayed as loyal, childlike, generally unthinking, and just happy to breathe the same air as the whites. This continued well onto the 60s, where even though actors like Sidney Poitier had roles that were no longer one-dimensional, they still worked to improve the lives of white people. Poitier was in no way submissive in his roles. In fact, he was often the smartest character, but his enlightenment was never in service to himself. It was always in service to others, specifically white others. Think Magical Negro, something that I've also talked about. In movies like Lilies of the Field and even later in Driving Miss Daisy, the black characters existed to solve the problems of the white characters. Not to mention that, like in the days of old, they were completely distinct. But Uncle Tom's mutation didn't end there. No. Because we live in a capitalistic society, it was only a matter of time before the caricature was modified and slapped onto cereal and rice such as Rastus and Uncle Ben, respectively. Both of which, by the way, were presented as barely literate black chefs that simply existed to serve their nation. Nice and docile-like, with a smile. After all, we don't want to scare the audience, do we? Sound familiar?
That's what I'm talking about. That's what America wants. Nice and calm.
Uncle Sam demands that black masculinity be in service to the system, that it exist within the confines of a palatable structure, or else.
Scorekeeper, deduct one life.
So, while Uncle Tom may have been created as an attack on slavery through distortion, reinvention, and reproduction, it's moved so far away from that, and I don't think it'll ever go back. At least not until we've collectively stopped putting the system above community. And that's all for now, folks. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and give a big old thumbs up. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!